Hi, this is Jamie Franklin, curator here at the Bennington Museum. Welcome to another tour at 10. We're back here in our Robert Frost exhibition, at present in Vermont. And today, I thought we would talk a little bit about the painter, Charles Birchfield, his work, his connections to Robert Frost, and the relationship between Frost and Birchfield's work as an artist. And so behind me, I have a facsimile of a page from Charles Birchfield's journal. And so Birchfield really became one of the leading American artists, modern artists, in the 1920s and 30s. Had a major retrospective at MoMA in the early 30s, one of the first major American artists to receive a retrospective at MoMA. He had grown up in Ohio, in rural Ohio, but in 1921 he moved to Buffalo, New York, where he met with J.J. Lanks. And J.J. Lanks is probably the artist with which Robert Frost had the closest relationship during his years in living in Shaftesbury here in Vermont. Lanks ended up illustrating a number of Frost's collections of poems with his wood engravings. And so in the summer of 1924, J.J. Lanks and Charles Birchfield took a road trip from Buffalo over to this part of the world. And on their way, they actually met with the painter George Bellows in Woodstock, New York. And then driving north, they stopped at a bookstore in Pittsfield, Massachusetts called The Open Book, which Frost's daughters, Irma and Marjorie, I may make sure I'm getting those names right. Yes, Irma and Marjorie had opened up earlier that spring, and then they continued north. And so this was in August of 1924, and Birchfield, in addition to being a painter, as he's best known, actually had aspirations to be a writer, actually particularly a nature writer. He was also interested in contemporary American authors of the period, Willa Cather, Sinclair Lewis, Upton Sinclair, a lot of the realists and regionalist artists who became really popular in the 1920s and 30s. And so it's no surprise that Birchfield would have been interested in meeting Robert Frost, who had recently struck up a relationship with his friend J.J. Lanks. And so I think it may be wonderful to hear Birchfield's recollection of his visit to the Frost farm in South Shaftesbury, now known as the Robert Frost Stone House Museum. He says, "Robert Frost's at late afternoon. Find them on the porch at rear, Mrs. Frost fixing string beans. We spend a pleasant time talking after supper. We got up to a rise of ground back of the house and play at quoits, which is a yard game. Blue hills to the north, disappearing in overlapping succession. Sun setting, a cool wind out of the north. It reminds me of my childhood, how north felt to me. We played until dark with only the moon to light us, and we had to tie handkerchiefs on the stakes. After we go indoors, discussing numerous subjects such as spiritualism and modern civilization. Frost played us some good records of Bert Williams. And he just goes on to describe spending the night in the barn, hearing the chickens pecking in the morning, the cows bawling, because the Frosts did have a lively, active farm. But this wonderful interaction between Birchfield, Lanks, and the Frost family in the summer of 1924. And so, as I've done throughout this exhibition, I've included a number of works by artists that were connected to Frost. And so I'm really pleased to be able to have this painting. Birchfield's probably best known for working in the medium of watercolor. He made large-scale watercolors, and we'll end this talk in front of one of those. But here is one of his rare oil paintings. And this painting, which is called The Evening Star, dates between 1923 and 1926. He worked on it over a course of a couple of years, and this is, of course, the exact time in which he met Frost in 1924. It depicts a family of 3 deer, a doe, her fawn, as well as a buck kind of hidden over here in the shadows at dusk time as the sun is setting, and you see a single star in the sky. And actually, that's probably the planet Venus. But the theme of the nighttime sky was one that Birchfield and Frost both came back to in their work over and over again throughout this period in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so I've paired this Birchfield painting with a couple of excerpts from poems by Frost in which he talks about the nighttime sky and the stars. And so this painting has a real sense of sort of peace and restfulness. And one of the poems by Frost that I paired it with is called On Looking Up by Chance at the Constellations. And it reads, "You'll wait a long time for anything much to happen in heaven beyond the float of clouds. We may as well go patiently on with our life. It wouldn't award the watcher to stay awake in hopes of seeing the calm of heaven break on his particular time and personal sight. That calm seems certainly safe to last the night." But of course he also talked more about kind of the stars and the heavens as metaphors, not just for kind of peace and tranquility and sort of the calmness of the heavenly skies. But he also I've also included another excerpt from a poem called Lost in Heaven. It says, "The clouds, the source of rain, one stormy night, offered an opening to the source of dew, which I accepted with impatient sight. Looking for my old sky marks in the blue, but stars were scarce in that part of the sky. I sighed, where in heaven am I? But don't tell me, oh, opening clouds, by opening on me wide, let's let my heavenly lostness overwhelm me." The idea of using the stars to kind of position yourself in the world, as sailors used to do. He could only find a couple of stars. In this painting, you only see one star or planet, as it may be, and this idea of getting lost in the heavens. Again, Frost, like Birchfield, loved to use the natural world, nature, animals, the landscape, as metaphor for the human condition and human issues. Let's just walk around the corner and look at the other Birchfield painting in the exhibition. This is one of Birchfield's great large-scale watercolors, for which he's probably best known. This is titled The Glory of Spring. It's on loan to us from the Williams College Museum of Art, and I should have said earlier, the painting we were looking at earlier was on loan to us from the Birchfield Penny Art Center over in Buffalo. And so I've paired this large-scale watercolor, which typical of Birchfield's work was actually created over a fairly long span of time. This was first started in 1934, while Frost was still living here in Shaftesbury, and completed in 1955. And actually, if you look really closely, you can start to see joints in the paper. So the central image of the kind of abandoned shack in the forest with the crows was probably what Birchfield had started with in 1934, and then he expanded it out to include all of these trees. But I've paired this Birchfield kind of transcendent vision of springtime in the Northeast with an excerpt from Frost's poem called Spring Pools. These pools that, though in forests, still reflect the total sky almost without defect, and like the flowers beside them chill and shiver, will like the flowers beside them soon be gone, and yet not out by any brook or river, but up by roots to bring dark foliage on. And I think, Frost really kind of didn't like to think of himself as a nature poet. He once said in an interview, only 2 of my poems don't have people in them. Of course, there are no people in many of Birchfield's works, but I think the viewer stands in as the human in relationship to the scene depicted. And both Frost and Birchfield were very much interested in the specificities of nature. Frost loved to walk in the woods. He was particularly fond of trees, and of course this Birchfield has beautiful examples of birches with their early flowers during springtime. Crows figure their way into Frost's poetry regularly. So there are all of these parallels and kind of relationships between the way in which Frost and Birchfield used the natural world as a metaphor for kind of human experience and kind of the magical, mysterious experience of living. And so it's a real pleasure. Birchfield is one of my personal favorite artists, to be able to bring these Birchfields here to Bennington and help contextualize Frost's work as a writer with the visual artists that he knew and might have been reading or looking at. We certainly know that Birchfield was reading Frost, and Frost undoubtedly was looking at Birchfield during this period, and see these sorts of relationships and parallels between their work. Again, thank you for joining me for this episode of Tours at 10. Please come and see these works in person. It's always best to be able to look and view. I mean, you could stand in front of a painting like this for a long time, seeing new things, the ephemeral flowers, the butterfly, the crows, the beautiful light in the sky. And so do come and see these in person. And we'll see you next week for another tour at 10.